Okay, we're recording. So we left off talking about English dramatic music and Henry Purcell's influence. So the piece I asked you to listen for last time that we didn't quite get to at the end was an excerpt from Dido and Aeneas. So let's look at this particular scene and what makes it, no, don't highlight anything. I just want to pull up the slide. Okay. So let's look at this particular scene and what makes it so interesting. So Mr. Josias Priest's boarding school at Chelsea, surprisingly, was the site of the premiere of Dido and Aeneas. It was actually written for a group of girls, students at a girls' boarding school. This was not meant to be a courtly entertainment. This was for, maybe rich kids, let's say. So on the one hand, it is a pedagogical piece, but on the other hand, it is really representative of everything that the English read into the operatic genre. So this piece is really closely related to a theater mask. Remember, we talked about how, theater masks evolved out of the court masks in the Tudor era, and now we're looking into the era of the Glorious Revolution. Somebody remind me what the Glorious Revolution was?
It was when William of Orange and Mary, I believe, they came. They were pretty much invited to England, and then like the power shifted without like any combat or anything.
Exactly. So Mary and her husband, William of Orange. Mary was the daughter of the English king, and she was very Protestant leaning. The English were afraid that her father, the king, was too Catholic leaning. So they brought Mary and her husband, William, to rule over England as opposed to her poor old dad. And that we call the Glorious Revolution. Now, why does this matter? Because we are dealing with the dichotomy between Protestant and Catholic artistic theories and aesthetics and philosophies surrounding how art should be used in society and art's values. Now, remember, Catholics were using art to evoke a really dramatic personal response to the divine. Protestants viewed art in very different ways. So this is very much a secular and even political piece. So that's what we're dealing with here. Now, the problem with bringing dramatic music to Italy is that the English language doesn't necessarily lend itself to text setting in the way that vowel-rich languages like Italian do. So if anybody listens to an Italian speaker, what you're really paying attention to are the vowels. With English, we're a very consonant-heavy language. Consonants are great for articulation, but very difficult. I have singers in the room, right? What's your favorite language to sing in and why?
I would say Italian because it just sounds nice.
I certainly don't disagree. Italian.
I like Italian because it's just so forward, like in your placement, and it creates the nicest sound.
Do elaborate on that for me, Alexis, please. So it's forward.
So when I place vowels in Italian, it's all forward, and I get more ping, I guess. And it feels more comfortable to sing, because in English, a lot of our stuff is like back in our throat. I kind of feel the same about German too. A lot of like umlauts and mixed vowels are forward too. That's why I like those languages personally.
Everyone loves a good umlaut. But absolutely. So with those languages that you just mentioned, Italian, above all, it's very masky because you're not living back here to articulate. Yes, a lot of the consonants are dental and the vowels are pure. Exactly. Yes, everything is up here. Even when you do articulate with consonants, it's usually lips and teeth. It's not a lot of glottal stuff. So that is an inherent difficulty when we try and do this same musical technique in English, because a lot of our stuff is glottal. It's just, it's hard. I don't think I have to explain it to you guys. You're singers, you already understand what we're talking about here. But in addition to those consonants, there's this weird pattern of stressed and well, no, I should say this. In English, we have a lack of pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables. So if you're speaking Italian, you can generally assume that the stressed syllable will be the penultimate one. When you conjugate verbs, they're going to take the same pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables. So in English, we don't have that. English is a very irregular language. And the way Purcell handles this irregularity is by using a lot of Scotch snap rhythms. Has anyone heard of a Scotch snap?
Yeah, it's like da 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 da, right?
Yeah, it's short, long. So da-dum, da-dum, da-dum. If anyone's listened to Brigadoon, if I have any Brigadoon fans in here, Scotch snaps are all over the place. It's that thing that you, oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say it's like one of the most like used rhythms in rap music, but they just speed it up. They go like da 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 da. Like, if that makes sense.
Yeah, especially in 21st century trap. I'm not sure why the trap subgenre specifically is all about Scotch snaps, but I don't debate it. Yes, it's that short, long pattern. Dum, 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 dum. Okay, you hear it all the time with bagpipes. A lot of it has to do with typical English and Scottish percussion. We won't get into that. The thing that I need you to realize is that Henry Purcell uses that rhythm frequently in Dido and Aeneas because of the weirdness of the English language, okay? English language necessitates Scotch snaps, thumbs or hands. Anybody? Okay, good, good, good. Okay, so we feel good. The next thing you will notice in any setting of Dido, well, there's only one setting of, you know what I mean. The next thing you will notice in any performance, that's the word I'm looking for, of Dido and Aeneas, is the overbearing presence of madrigalisms. Remember when we talked about the English madrigal traveling from Italy to England, and when the English adopted madrigals, they went way overboard on the madrigalisms. They took it to its extreme. So when we have, you know, as Vesta was from Latmos Hill descending, we listen to that example, and we hear the notes literally descending. When the voices say one by one, two by two, we have singers joining in with each fragment of that phrase. So the English loved them some madrigalisms. And Purcell is continuing that all the way through 1689. He's still doing that decades after the English madrigal had fallen out of fashion. Yes. So the aria that we are going to listen to, When I Am Laid in Earth, is what we call a ground bass aria. What that means is we've got a short bass line that keeps repeating over and over and over. Sounds kind of similar to an isorhythmic motet, right? When we have the tenor line doing its talia and color over and over and over. The difference here is not necessarily the repetition, but the texture around it. So when we did isorhythmic motets and we had that type of repetition, we had polyphony surrounding that tenor, both of voices above it and voices below it. And that tenor voice was one voice among many. Here with a ground bass aria, this bass line, it serves a very crucial function, much like we're in the common practice period here. It is the harmonic foundation of the entire aria. So this ground bass is going to be what determines the harmonies that go above it. Does that make sense to everybody? Thumbs or hands? Okay. Good. So this aria that we're going to hear, When I Am Laid in Earth, is a ground bass aria. It's a specific type of ground bass aria called a lament. Now, I hinted at this before, but what signifies a lament in music is a descending tetrachord, 4 notes that go down, usually do, te, la, sol. You just go right down the scale. So that lament is signified by those 4 notes. And Purcell keeps repeating that descending tetrachord over and over and over again. But if you look at your scores, what you'll notice is Purcell extends it. He goes through those 4 steps, but he does it chromatically by half steps. So he's not even just going do, te, la, sol. He's going do, ti, te, la, le. Wait, do, ti, te, la, le. Okay, do, ti, te, la, le, sol. So he extends the lament by moving by half step even, rather than whole steps. Yes, exactly. It's a chromatic scale, descending chromatic scale. So that lament is being drawn out. Over that ground bass lament, he puts this really irregular melody. It starts on a weird beat. He puts rests in at odd times because you're hearing Dido catch her breath at weird times. She's poisoned herself at this point, right? This is when she's drinking the poison to kill herself. So the odd beats, the odd rests, the melismas on odd words, those are all going to give us a sense of like, you know, she's struggling to breathe. She's just struggling to articulate at this point. So it all coalesces into a sense of the singer's final moments. Any questions or thoughts before we give this a listen? Okay, let's check it out. The thing that I want you to meditate on as we're listening to this is, how does Purcell make you feel like Dido is dying in this moment? Okay, what do you hear that makes you feel like, oh, these are her last moments?
But death invades me. Death is no
So there's our recitative. Now we're starting the lament. Okay, and I want to go just a little bit forward so we can hear her final outburst, if you will. Oh, sorry, I went just a little bit past it. Okay, here we go. Okay, there we go. So we heard her final outburst. What does Purcell do there that makes you feel like we are watching someone expire?
At the end, it just kind of like gently but depressingly just like comes down the minor scale and just like sets down on the tonic. And it's just kind of like, wow, I'm sad now.
Well, and it's not just at the end, right? That bass line is what we've got sitting under the whole thing, right? That dragging motion has been pulling us down. And it's like a never-ending dredge of a cycle. Yeah, excellent. And Mai says melodic lines moving down. Yeah, precisely. Whenever we move down by half step, that's what a lot of musicians call a sigh motive. And it sounds like a sigh. If you're ever like worried about something and you go, huh, your voice is going down. So whenever we move down by half step, we call it a sigh. And this whole melodic thing is built on sigh motives. Yeah. Excellent. Seems delayed. Final cadence. Ooh, yeah. Yes. That's that irregular melody, Allie, that we were talking about. It's especially right after she goes up to that really high note. I won't attempt it because I like you all too much to subject you to that. But when she goes up to that really high note, remember me, and then she has that little melisma on forget my fate. It's like she's holding on to that little she's holding on to that melisma because she's just trying to make it to the end. Yeah, absolutely. That delayed cadence is precisely, it just feels like you're drifting away. Cool. Really good insights, guys. Anything else? Okay. Great insights. Let's keep going. Oh, I could be looking way too deep. Her descending line. No. That is absolutely not looking too deep. That's exactly what Purcell's going for. Great, Alexis. Remember, this is madrigalisms taken to the extreme. So a descending line would very much be like descending into the underworld. Absolutely. And physically descending into a plot of earth. Like she's saying, when I'm laid in earth, right? When you bury me. So absolutely. That is not looking too far at all. That's perfect. That's what Purcell would want. Okay. So I'm going to stop sharing Purcell and get that off the screen. And let's go into today's topic. Here we go. Everyone seeing the PowerPoint? Okay. So let's go into today's topic, which is again this branching out of vocal genres. So we've been talking about how Italian opera has spread throughout the continent, and last time we took a tour around Europe in England and France to see what they were doing with the genre. Let's check back in with the Italians as opera itself develops. So in the late 17th century, so like the end of the 1600s, notice guys, we're almost a century into the Baroque at this point. So in the late 17th century, we start to see a dichotomy emerge, a binary between opera seria and opera buffa. Now, this was originally not a defined, a clearly rigid distinction, but there had been serious operas and funny or comic operas for a while. Remember when we talked about L'Incoronazione di Poppea? We said there were those funny characters like the guy in drag and the senator Seneca, who was like lost in his own mellifluous melodies. So we had comic and serious elements for a while, but by the end of the 17th century, we start to see a really rigid binary form between operas that are serious and operas that are comic. So opera seria is the more prestigious, the revered opera. It's actually called Neapolitan opera because that was supposedly the site of, you know, the greatest. Later, like in the modern era, we started calling this time the first bel canto. So obviously people in the 1600s were not calling this music the first bel canto. So that's a term that we've since applied, but we apply it to Italian opera seria of the late 17th and early 18th centuries because of the emphasis on vocal technique, the emphasis on vocal virtuosity and melody. So if you ever hear something about the first bel canto, know that we are talking about late 17th, early 18th century opera seria. In these opera serias, we see a dominance of da capo arias. We talked about da capo arias before. Someone remind me what they are. Or do we need a refresher? Okay, let's do a
Yeah.
a refresher wouldn't hurt. Let's do it. Okay. So da capo aria, as you all know, da capo means from the beginning, right? From the head. Capo is head. That's why you wear your cap on your head. So da capo, from the head. So what a da capo aria is a specific form of aria. And I literally mean form like you would see in form and analysis class. So you've got an A section where the singer expresses one standard thought. Here's my feeling, here's my affect. Then I've got a B section where the singer expresses a new thought. So we shift gears. A section, first thought. B section, shifting gears. At the end of the B section, the composers would mark da capo. So from the beginning. So I go back to the A section. So really what I'm doing is creating a ternary form. A section, B section, A section again. Does that make sense to everybody? Thumbs or hands? Okay, good. I'm seeing a lot of thumbs. Now, the tricky thing about a da capo aria is that when you repeat the A section, when you go through that second time, you as the singer have to improvise ornaments in the moment. You have to pull out all the tricks in the repeat because your audience doesn't want to hear the same thing over and over again. They already heard you sing that once. They don't care about hearing you sing the exact same thing again. They want to hear you pull out all the virtuosic stops the second time around. So you have A section, B section, really elaborate A section again. Does that make sense? Thumbs or hands? Awesome. Okay. So da capo arias were the standard form of aria in opera seria. The soloists we see in opera seria are generally high voices, so sopranos and castrati. Now, there's a very scientific reason for that, and that is simply that in an era when there are no microphones, high voices carry a lot easier, especially over an orchestra. And that's the reason even today, most prima donnas and primo uomos are sopranos and tenors, because the human ear is just built to hear higher frequencies easier than lower frequencies. So in opera seria, we see sopranos and castrati in the leading roles. Now, this is the next thing I'm going to say is something new that just came about in the end of the 17th century. And what composers started doing at the end of the 17th century was only using recitativo accompagnato, only using accompanied recitative. So we've talked before about recitativo secco, dry recitative, where it's just a basso continuo plus voice. And we've talked about recitativo accompagnato, where you have the whole orchestra. Recitativo accompagnato is the only type of recit you will hear in an opera seria. That is the only type of recit they were allowed to use, okay? The librettist that we most associate with these operas is a guy named Pietro Metastasio. He was a poet / librettist who defined what opera should be for well over a century. He just cranked out tons of opera libretti, and composers clamored to set them. So you will actually hear several operas from different composers, all based on the same Metastasio libretto. Why did everybody clamor to set them? Because Metastasio embodied what Baroque composers and dramatists thought opera should be. He had very strict rules about the type of affect that you can put on stage. He had very strict rules about the order that you go through those affects and so on and so forth. Now, I don't need you to memorize those rules, but I do need you to memorize Pietro Metastasio's name as the librettist par excellence of opera seria. These operas all dealt with larger than life heroes, kings, gods. These are high tragedies that everyday people could not participate in. Okay, these are strictly the supernatural, larger than life characters. On the other hand, we have opera buffa, comic opera. Think like a buffoon is someone you laugh at, a clown. So buffa, opera buffa, funny opera. Okay. Now this originated specifically in mid 1700s Naples. Don't get that confused with the fact that opera seria is called Neapolitan. So when you're reading texts and you see Neapolitan opera, you know it's opera seria. But historically, opera buffa did originate in the city of Naples. And the way these things originated was they weren't entertainments in and of itself. Much like the original intermedi at the Medici courts, we have acts that filled in the intermissions of an opera seria. So opera seria would generally have 3 acts. In those 2 intermissions between those 3 acts, there would be a separate, smaller, funny opera. Does that make sense to everybody? Thumbs or hands? Okay. Good. I'm seeing more thumbs. Okay. So these things weren't their own entertainments, they just filled in the intermissions of opera seria. Now, in contrast to the soloists of opera seria, opera buffa placed far more importance on the ensemble work. It could get really complex. And the singers, the chorus really got to show off, especially in the finales of each act. So everything, every aria, every recit in a short act of opera buffa would be building to these really complicated, dense finales. So the emphasis in an opera buffa is again on the ensemble, not the soloist. And our characters in these opera buffa, again in contrast to opera seria, these opera buffa characters are common, everyday, relatable people that we identify with. These are Joe Schmo down the street. This is, oh, hey, that happened to me just last week. Oh, isn't this just so typical? So opera buffa is something we can all, it's something very relatable, very not mundane because it was still entertaining, but understandable. Does that make sense to everybody? Thumbs hands, okay, good. So that is opera seria versus opera buffa. If you guys feel good about the distinction between the two, let's look further to the instrumental innovations that accompanied these vocal innovations. So it's no surprise that as we move through the years, instrumental technology and what we're capable of on machine, your instrument is a machine. So what we are capable of on these machines is going to change. Now, before we head into the instrumental world, I just want to remind us of the history that we're coming from. Remember St. Mark's Basilica in Venice and what we call the Venetian School. Those composers at St. Mark's, like Andrea Gabrieli, Giovanni Gabrieli, Monteverdi, Heinrich Schütz, all of those composers that were centered at St. Mark's and were able to use the vast resources of the choir school and the instrumental ensembles there. Remember that this is the locus of motetti concertati, those arranged or concerted motets that Schütz then brought back to Germany with his Symphoniae Sacrae. Remember the greater precision in notation that we are able to experience in the Baroque era, largely thanks to the printing press, but also just because of tastes changing. We talked about those embellishments or agréments, if we want to be French. There's a greater precision in dynamic markings. In our medieval, in our Renaissance stuff, did you ever see something marked piano or forte or mezzo piano or anything like that? No, right? They wouldn't have written that. But in the Baroque era, they actually start telling you how loud to play. The Baroque era sees a new emphasis on virtuosity. In other words, technique becomes part of your artistry. We've talked about idiomatic part writing before. Can anyone remind me what idiomatic part writing means? That's a fancy word for just a very straightforward concept.
It's like part writing that's conducive to how the instrument works. It's like if you're writing a trombone part and they didn't have like a trigger on their trombone, you wouldn't make them go between B flat and C over and over again.
Absolutely. So Mark gave us a great definition, a great example. That is idiomatic part writing. And because of that idiomatic part writing, instrumentalists were now expected to be experts at their machine. You are supposed to have, in Renaissance music, if they wanted more volume. Yeah, that was one way of getting more volume out. A lot of times they just didn't mark it though, right? That wasn't something that a composer felt responsible for. That could be something performers decided in the moment. But a composer that would, yeah, would largely leave that up to whoever's doing the singing, their discretion. That's a good question, Matt. Yeah, but absolutely, especially in madrigals, when we are talking about text painting, if you wanted your text to reflect something louder, then absolutely we could add more voices. Good. Okay, so virtuosity. Over all of this, oops, nope, go here. There we go. Over all of this background, we start to, when I say we, I mean obviously Baroque composers, start to invent new genres. So probably the most important genre that you will see emerging is that of the sonata, and that encompasses both solo sonatas, so instruments or pieces for one instrumentalist and an accompaniment, or trio sonatas where we have two melodic voices plus accompaniment. So a solo sonata is soloist plus basso continuo. Somebody remind me what basso continuo is.
Is it the figured bass, like?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's the part that plays the figured bass. So the figured bass would be the line that they're looking at. The basso continuo would be the instruments that are doing that. Yeah, absolutely. So that basso continuo would consist of usually one melodic instrument and one harmonic instrument. What do I mean by that? One instrument that sustains the note, so something like a viola da gamba, and one instrument that realizes harmony, so something like a harpsichord or a theorbo, where you can play multiple notes at the same time. So I've got one note, or one instrument, sorry, one instrument that's holding each bass note, and another instrument that's playing the harmonies for that held note. And I have flexibility in which instruments I want to include. Sometimes I might want to use an organ. Sometimes I might want to use a harpsichord or a clavichord or a spinet or whatever. We have options, and I have flexibility in whatever I want my basso continuo to be played by. But in a sonata, it is instrumental soloist plus basso continuo. In a trio sonata, I have two melodic voices, so two soloists, plus a basso continuo. So it's not that far of a stretch to see two soloists and this guy here, trio, right? That makes sense to everyone? Yeah, thumbs hand, good. Okay, I see a couple thumbs. Good, a few thumbs, good. Okay. So like in this picture here, I'm looking at a trio sonata. Why? Because I have one soloist here on that looks, I can't tell if it's a recorder or an early oboe, but some kind of wind instrument. I have another soloist on violin, and here's my basso continuo. Okay, so here's a trio sonata going on. So that's the type of texture we're looking at here. Usually, my two melodic voices are going to be played by two violins. So this is a little bit odd here that we have a wind player, but certainly not unheard of. So usually my two melodic voices are violins, but it could be any really permutation. It could be violin and cello. It could be violin and viola. Heck, it could be two cellos. It could be wind instruments, whatever, as long as I have two soloists plus continuo. Now, a distinction that we'll talk about a little more later is the distinction between sonata da camera and sonata da chiesa. So a chamber sonata and a church sonata. Usually a chamber sonata is going to do, it's a prelude plus 4 dance movements. A composer named Arcangelo Corelli is the one who really defines that genre for us. And we start to see this emerge in the late 17th century. So about the same time that we're starting to distinguish between opera seria and opera buffa. And the Sonata da Chiesa is a church sonata. So chamber sonata, church sonata. Really, the music sounded very much the same. The only difference is that they don't put dance titles in a Sonata da Chiesa because it's not appropriate to have dances in a church, okay? We'll talk more about that distinction towards the end of class, but I just want to throw that out there now. Okay, so I said this guy, Arcangelo Corelli, was the one who really defines the genre for it. And I can't overstate his importance because he was a violinist slash composer slash conductor. Now, the idea of a conductor in the Baroque era was a completely new idea. You didn't have conductors before the Baroque era. First of all, ensembles weren't really big enough to need them. But secondly, the leader of an ensemble would have been part of the ensemble, usually either the principal violinist or the harpsichordist. One of those two performers would take the role of leader. But Corelli, for the first time, we actually start to see him step out of the ensemble and conduct. Now, most of his repertoire is sonatas and trio sonatas. And again, I can't overstate his importance because he was the first composer in the history of music to make an entire career composing instrumental music. He never wrote anything to be sung. We have never seen a composer before Arcangelo Corelli do that. He had sacred and secular posts, so there is a blurring of that da Chiesa and da Camera distinction. But the example that I asked you to listen to is apart from his trio sonata, and this is a Sonata da Chiesa. Now, again, we're dealing with something very similar to chamber music. What does Sonata da Chiesa mean that da Camera doesn't? Well, there is a lot of imitative counterpoint in this trio sonata. We've been talking about what imitation means, so I don't think I have to go back over that again. But you don't see that imitation in dance music because you can't dance to imitation, right? If you're going to dance, you need a steady step. If I have imitation going, then the lines stop and start. They're not a fluid, continual thing that I can just move to. So the overbearing imitation in this sonata is part of the da Chiesa part. We think this may have been played during Mass because there are parts of the Mass where in the Baroque era, ensembles would substitute instrumental music for the sung repertoire that we had been accustomed to. So that's what we mean by da Chiesa here, the imitation and the possibility that it was played during Mass. There are, as per to be expected, 3 melodic voices and continuo. Now, why? I just said that a trio sonata has 2 melodic voices, right? Didn't I? But what makes this 3 melodic voices is that you will often hear one of the continuo players step into the role of soloists. Does that make sense to everybody? I have 2 soloists and continuo, and that continuo steps into the melody quite frequently.
So there are still only 3 people. It's just sometimes the basso continuo player jumps in to do the melody.
Basically, yes. Now remember, there's flexibility in that basso continuo, so I could have a 4th, right? My basso continuo could be played by 2 separate people, say one on harpsichord, one on viola da gamba. Does that make sense? Okay. So it might be 4 people, but 3 of them are taking the role of soloist. Okay. So that's what distinguishes this as a trio sonata. So my soloists are 2 treble and that 1 bass voice popping up from the continuo. So I've got this like registral contrast that makes the texture very interesting. My two treble soloists and the one bass voice popping up to the melody keeps it interesting. And that continuo often doubles. So like say if I have my da gamba and my harpsichord, that harpsichord is going to keep doubling the bass solo, okay? This trio sonata is, as per usual, most trio sonatas did consist of 4 movements, and they alternate slow, fast, slow, fast. And this is the perfect, one of the earliest examples of functional harmony. We now have tonality as we understand it. Remember, I said this is the common practice period. We can start analyzing things in chords. So tonality, tonic, dominant, subdominant, all that fun stuff is governing the harmonic progressions here. Because of that, we start to see circle of fifths sequences. So Corelli does this really energetic thing. He keeps lines going by moving through the circle of fifths. And he also keeps lines going through chord progressions by spicing it up with chains of suspensions. Okay. Any questions before we take a listen to this trio sonata? Okay, so I'm going to play just a bit of it. And the question that I want you to think about, as I'm just going to play some of the first movement, the question that I want you to think about as I play this is, how does Corelli keep us interested even when we don't have a text to pay attention to? What is Corelli doing to keep you engaged? Okay, so we've got that beautiful extended section there. How did he keep you with him?
Well, the biggest one is probably dynamic contrast, because like you can use different voices like gliding in and out of prominence, like sort of in and out of the foreground, back into the background, you know, like swelling that kind of way. And then the other one was like, instead of just having like, let's say like block chords, use a lot of like anticipations and suspensions.
Absolutely. So let's to talk about that textural stuff first. Corelli is such a master of that. Now remember, he's pretty much inventing this for the first time, right? And the way he constantly shifts between those high voices and bringing that lower voice into prominence, and at the same time balancing them and blending them with each other. Yes. And of course, these patterns of tension and release, tension and release in terms of suspensions and anticipations. He is giving us this first glimmer of the way tonality and functional harmony work. This idea of, I have a tonic, I move away from it, I move back to it, away, back, away, back. So that's where our suspensions and anticipations take us. Anything else? Okay, let's keep going. So another genre, instrumental genre, that you will see emerge in the Baroque era is the solo concerto. Now, in contrast to the solo sonata, where I had soloist plus just basso continuo, with a solo concerto, I have a soloist plus a full orchestra. Much like today, if I play a sonata, I'll just have a pianist with me, right? But if I play a concerto, I have a whole symphony orchestra behind me. That distinction came from the Baroque era. And we start to see the term concerto in use starting in the last 20 years of the 17th century. So notice this is all percolating around the same time, the late 17th century. And these solo concertos actually branched off from full orchestral pieces when composers decided to feature one particular instrument, a soloist. In contrast to the sonatas, which were 4 movements, slow, fast, we only use 3 movements in the concerto, fast, slow, fast. And we can view these concertos as a dialogue between the soloist and the full orchestra. That idea should sound very familiar to us because that is an idea that is carried through the centuries. So, sonata, solo concerto. In contrast to the solo concerto, we have what we call the concerto grosso, and we call this the Roman concerto because much like opera buffa came out of Naples, the concerto grosso came out of Rome. Now, the concerto grosso is very different from a solo concerto. Really, what we have here in a concerto grosso is a small group of soloists, usually just 3 or 4 people, accompanied by a full orchestra. And we see this term in use by 1670. That small group of soloists is called the concertino. Ino, it's a diminutive, it's a little concert, it's a concertino. So usually this concertino consisted of a trio of 2 violins and cello. So really it's like having an amplified trio sonata. And this concertino, these 3 or 4 featured players, were salaried experts hired by the court. Like they lived and worked in the court. They were regulars. Backing up this concertino would be the ripieno, or full orchestra. These were freelancers hired ad hoc, like, oh, hey, this concerto, we need some violas for this. Well, go hire me some violas. So these were freelancers. And in the score, we see the ripieno labeled tutti, everyone. Okay, so concertino, concertino, little group. Ripieno, full orchestra. Concertino, salaried experts at court. Ripieno, freelancers who were hired ad hoc. Now, rather than conceiving of the orchestra as a collection of soloists, the texture of these concerti grossi was unified. So we start to think vertically instead of horizontally. With our counterpoint, we had to think horizontally. We had to move one melodic voice, then set another independent voice above it, another independent voice below, and so on and so forth. With this grouping, we can finally analyze vertically chords. I have chords for the first time. Now, these concerti grossi were generally in, there we go, ritornello form. What ritornello form is? Alternating ritornelli, so these repeating sections that stayed the same each time, with these episodes that changed each time. So I have a ritornello, an episode, ritornello, episode, ritornello, episode. And each time the ritornello is going to be the same. It's the same chunk of music that comes back. The episodes are new each time. So the ritornello is performed by the full orchestra, the ripieno. It is tonally stable. It doesn't modulate. It sits in one key for the whole section. When the ritornello comes back, it might just be part of it that comes back. We might not hear the whole ritornello, but every time it comes back, it will be unison. It will be prominent. It will be featured. You will hear that ritornello smacking you in the face. And these ritornelli are usually simpler than the episodes. They're usually easier to play. They're usually homophonic and very repetitive. In contrast, the episodes that were new each time are played by the concertino, the little group of soloists. They're not tonally stable, they modulate. An episode might start in A minor and move to E major. And these episodes were virtuosic displays. Again, with that rise of idiomatic part writing, these instrumentalists are expected to be experts at their machines. Okay, so the episodes are where these soloists get to show off. And the entire concerto grosso genre was about contrasting, all kinds of contrasts of texture, complexity, dynamics, with the function of sounds, the function of chords, range. So I've got those high voices versus the low voices, rhythmic tension. All of these contrasts are in play. Now, the complaint that we tend to get about concerti grossi, because those ritornelli just keep coming back, is, are these things interesting? Because there's so much repetition. There's just so much that here, oh, here's that chunk again. Look, there's that chunk, and so on and so forth. So that's the complaint that we tend to get about the concerto grosso genre. Before we look at an example, does anyone have any questions? Does everyone feel confident about what a concerto grosso is? Like if I asked you guys, what is a concerto grosso? Would you feel comfortable writing about a paragraph of explanation? Thumbs or hands? Oh, I saw, oh,
So maybe.
maybe. Well, what feels a little hazy, Nathan?
Oh, just the like writing a paragraph about it.
Okay. Well, it,
I get the gist.
okay. What still seems gisty and not concrete? How about if I ask it that
Um, I don't know. I just like I get the gist like of the form and like that it stays in one key and like all that stuff.
way? Well, the ritornelli stay in one key. Those episodes are going to modulate each time.
Oh, okay, I see.
Mhm. And if so the ritornello will come back in different keys, it just doesn't modulate. So if my ritornello starts in D major, but my episode modulates from D major to F major, then my ritornello is going to come back in F major.
Yeah,
It just won't modulate anywhere else. Does that make sense?
yeah.
Cool. So basically, let's just starting from the beginning, little kernel and expanding. We've got in a concerto grosso, we've got a small group of soloists, the concertino, versus the big group of the ripieno. Concertino, ripieno, concertino, ripieno. Concertino plays these virtuosic episodes that go all around. The ripieno plays these very stable, repetitive ritornelli. And we start ritornello episode 1. Ritornello is back, episode 2. Ritornello is back, episode 3. Now, does everyone feel good? Thumbs or hands? You guys are making me do my Dora the Explorer again. Okay, good. I'm seeing some thumbs. So let's look at a specific example by the master of the genre. If Corelli was our sonata guy, Vivaldi is our concerto guy. So much like Corelli, he was a violinist slash teacher slash composer. He was also, interestingly, a Catholic priest. They called him Il Prete Rosso, the red priest, because of his red hair. And he was the guy who defined the concerto grosso genre. So if Corelli defined sonatas, Vivaldi defined concerti grossi. Now, to understand Vivaldi's career, we have to kind of look at the city that he was working in. And specifically in Venice, they have this system of what they call ospedali. What English word does ospedale sound like to you guys?
Hospital.
Hospital. So I don't know how to phrase it. Okay, so they started out, these ospedali in Venice started out as like emergency places to heal people. But what happened was people kept bringing children and leaving children there. So they turned into orphanages. And these ospedali were specifically orphanages for girls. Boy children got raised in different institutions that were under a different name, but these ospedali were orphanages for girls. And they started in the 1400s. By the 1500s, they had become a systematized institution. The ospedale that Vivaldi worked at was called the Pietà, pity. So it's like charity, basically. And the thing about these ospedali were that if you're raising a bunch of girls in the Baroque era and they don't have fathers to pay their dowry, to get them marriageable, you have to teach them skills. You have to make them, for lack of a better word, marketable in some way. So these ospedali were known for their musical training because they relied on musical training as a way to marry off their girls, as well as using the performances as fundraisers. Basically, they would hold these concerts, and these revered children prodigies, if you will, these revered young musicians would be earning the donations through their performances. Now, each ospedale specialized in different instrumental or musical genres. And the Pietà, where Vivaldi worked at, was known for its string orchestra. So the Ospedale della Pietà hired expert teachers to train and compose for their student string orchestra. So that's Vivaldi's métier. That's the milieu he's in. And one of the pieces that he writes while he's at the Ospedale della Pietà is this collection called Il Cimento dell'Armonia e dell'Invenzione. You don't have to memorize that title. What I need you to remember is that the first four pieces of Vivaldi's big collection were unified as a cycle called the Four Seasons. So these first four pieces of the collection are titled after each season. And each piece has what we call a demonstrative sonnet. So a poem that goes with it to explain the narrative. So I have a sonnet about spring, and Vivaldi is going to take that sonnet and turn it into music. So what that means is we have musical mimesis. Somebody remind me what mimesis is. We've talked about it before.
The
Or do we-
music sounds like what it's representing. Like if you have like in La Primavera, there's like a motif of like birds chirping or whatever, and they have like fingered tremolos on the violins.
Perfect. So that is mimesis. The music is mimicking something like birdsong. And this Primavera concerto is made up of 3 movements fast, slow, fast, no surprise. We already said that's the way concertos work. Movement 1 sets the first 2 quatrains of the sonnet. We talked about sonnet form when we talked about madrigals. So remember, we've got that quatrain, quatrain, tercet, tercet, 4 lines, 4 lines, 3 lines, 3 lines. So movement 1 represents those 2 4-line sections. And this first movement, like much concerti grossi, is in ritornello form. The ritornello, so that section that keeps repeating, is in binary form, A, B. So my ritornello form, ritornello episode, ritornello episode, ritornello episode. That ritornello, every time it comes back, has 2 sections, an A section and a B section. Because I'm cramming 2 quatrains into this first movement, it is the most narrative of the movements. There's the most action happening in this movement 1. Movement 2 is the first tercet. So the first of those 3-line chunks. So movement 2 only sets 3 lines as opposed to movement 1's 8 lines. So movement 2 is 3 lines. And what Vivaldi does in movement 2 to mimic this part of the sonnet is it's all about contrast for him here. He's going to give us very startling contrasts in terms of dynamics and register to keep making everything very surprising. Now, if movement 1 has the most narrative packed in, movement 2 has the most mimesis packed in. Movement 2 is where we hear the most direct representation of the text. And movement 3 is kind of just a little exclamation point on the end. It sets the second tercet, and it's the cherry on the sundae. Does everybody feel comfortable with this before we take a listen to movement 1? Okay. So the question that I want you to meditate on, just as we listen to movement 1, is this too repetitive for you? Or does Verdi keep it going satisfactorily? Okay, too repetitive, or no, that worked. Here we go. Okay, so we heard the ritornello, we heard episode 1, and now we're just getting back into the ritornello again. What do you think, guys? Too much or interesting?
I mean, I think it's interesting. I think the main motive develops, which is what you want, like, in terms of like not becoming stagnant. So
Yeah, so Vivaldi doesn't just give us a chunk. It kind of grows, right?
yeah, it developed. Whether it was like, maybe not even the main melody, but like maybe the harmony changed behind it, or like the dynamics changed, or yeah.
So those contrasts kept coming back to make it interesting. Oh, wait, this time it's loud, this time it's soft, this time it's the high instruments, this time it's the low. Good.
Yeah, I
Anybody
felt
else?
like it changed enough when there were repeated sections. I feel like it changed enough to keep it interesting.
Where did you guys hear the most change occur? Because I agree with you that the change and the contrasts are what make this fresh. Where did we hear the most change and the most contrast?
Well, into the next little section, there was like almost like seconds and stuff happening. Like, sounded like dissonance, like not a ton, but almost like these, yeah, I guess just more dissonant, like higher tones that were kind of like pushing against each other almost.
And that was between the soloists, right?
Yeah.
Excellent. So we've got these virtuosi playing really high notes, and sometimes they grate against each other and then they relax into this nice consonance. Absolutely. Now, if I'm listening to the soloists, am I in the ritornello or the episode?
Wouldn't that be in the episode?
Precisely. I know I have more than 2 people reacting to this. What do you guys think? As many of your classmates have already slipped out the door.
Yeah, I think it might just be because people are going to the next classes, maybe.
Oh, you guys. College is very different from when I went not so long ago. Okay, well, in that case, I will see you all Wednesday for the listening quiz. Do I have any questions before we pack up for the day? Okay, then you are free. Fly like Vivaldi's birds.
Thank you.
Thank you.